Alright, today's video is looking at the respiratory system. So the respiratory system is comprised of the lungs, so that's all we're going to focus on, and we're going to focus on just the gas exchange that's happening in the lungs. So when we look at the lungs themselves, there are a few parts that you should be familiar with, and if you need to look up a few extra aspects of these parts, then feel free to do so. But on the left side of the lungs, you'll see that we only have a two-section lung, or two lobes. So we have an upper and lower lobe, and that's because the heart is actually leans a little bit more to the left than it is to the right in your body, and so it takes up room in the lungs. So the left lung is actually a little bit smaller than the right lung. The right lung has three sections, so you have the upper, middle, and lower lobe, and beneath that you have the diaphragm. And what the diaphragm is just it's a giant muscle that stretches right across your whole thoracic cavity, and what it does is when it contracts, it increases the volume of the lungs, and creates what's called negative pressure. So the diaphragm contracts, and it creates negative volume. Sorry, not negative volume, negative pressure inside the lungs. So then the air is then forced into the lungs. So it's like a vacuum, and it just creates that negative pressure inside, and air rushes in. When it relaxes, it does the opposite, creates a high pressure on the inside, and then forces the air out of the person's lungs. So diaphragm is super important because it regulates how much air is coming in and out of the lungs. It works also with your intercostal muscles, which are the muscles in between your ribs, and those muscles will also help increase and decrease the size of the rib cage. Both of those work together to increase and decrease that lung volume. The other area that you want to look at is just where the gas exchange is actually occurring. So in that case, when we look at where the gas exchange is occurring, that's happening at the alveoli, and you'll see that they look like little clusters of grapes, and that's exactly the way you should think about it. They have the grapevine, and down the bottom you have all your grapes. Inside those grapes is where the gas exchange occurs. They're super small, but they have a really high surface area to volume ratio, which allows for diffusion to occur very, very easily between oxygen and carbon dioxide. A couple things you want to note here is, first of all, lots of capillaries that surround it, just like the digestive system, no different than that. What you'll find in the lungs is that the deoxygenated blood actually comes into the alveoli by the pulmonary artery. This is the only artery in the body that actually carries deoxygenated blood. And the opposite's true. Once the gas exchange has occurred, the oxygenated blood goes back by the pulmonary vein, and again, this is the only vein in the body that actually carries oxygen to a different tissue. In this case, both of these are being operated by the heart, which is our next section, and then they get circulated throughout the body. So the gas exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide is happening at the alveoli, through the capillary network, through the process of diffusion. A couple of things you want to note here in terms of the alveoli is just the mucus lining and gland. So the bronchioli are surrounded by that. That makes the air movement nice and smooth. And again, if you get a cold, that's what gets built up there, and that's why when you cough, you end up coughing up what they call phlegm, and that's usually just excess mucus that's in your lungs because it's just being in more production to get rid of that virus or bacteria that's in your lung. Now, before we get into actually how gas exchange is occurring, we're going to look at that quick review of the respiratory cycle. So remember that your body digests food and it ultimately goes into the form of glucose. Glucose goes into the cells, right? That's kind of the currency. That's how it has to get into the cell. Oxygen is delivered by the lungs through the respiration cycle. They combine together to produce carbon dioxide, which then goes back to the lungs, right? So we're looking at respiration, and respiration is really, how do we get O2 to the tissues and how do we get CO2 from the tissues? The rest of it is what your body's going to use, so it is going to transport H2O back to the lungs, and then your body's going to use energy for its different metabolic processes. Now, how does it actually get into the lungs? Is through what's called partial pressure. And so when we look at partial pressure, it's referred to as the total pressure of the mixture of gases. So think of everything that mixes up our atmosphere in terms of gases. So we have nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and so on. All those gases mix together and they produce a specific pressure. So this would be kind of the air pushing down on you. So at the atmospheric pressure, at sea level, we would say that the measurement is at 101.3 kilopascals. So kilopascals is the measurement we use to look at partial pressure. Now, when it break it down, we're only concerned with oxygen, and so oxygen makes up 20.9% of the atmosphere. So what we do is we take that number, that 20.9%, and then we're going to multiply it. So we're really taking that and putting it as a decimal. We're going to multiply that by 101.3 kilopascals. And so the 21.17 is how much pressure is actually contributed by oxygen. Now, that needs to get into our lungs, so that pressure continuously changes. Once it actually gets into our lungs and into the alveoli, then all we have is a pressure that is 13.3 kilopascals. So in the lungs, after it gets broken down, once it gets actually transported in there, the pressure that actually it exerts in the alveoli is 13.3. Now this is done by the process of diffusion. Pressure gradients work the same way. We always talk about substances, high concentration of a substance moving to a low concentration. Pressure gradients work the same way. We move from high pressure to low pressure. And that's always the case. Any kind of pressure changes will always flow that direction. And so what we end up having is a high pressure in the alveoli in the lungs. The capillaries that we just talked about, they're surrounding each alveoli. They have a low pressure of oxygen, and so we get that transport from high pressure to low pressure. And so we get a diffusion of oxygen into the capillaries. This is a significant pressure gradient, so that makes the diffusion process happen very rapidly. Once it's in the actual bloodstream, then it is transported by hemoglobin, and it's an iron type of hormone, protein I should say, that carries oxygen to and from tissues. And so it's got that combining capacity, so it's kind of the transportation vehicle for oxygen. Once the oxygen enters the actual tissue now, because that's the goal, right? We want to take oxygen from the lungs and actually get it to the tissue that needs it. The opposite pressure gradient is going to occur. So now what we have is in the tissues we have a low pressure, which is 5.33 kilopascals. And then in the capillaries, we're going to have this high pressure, it's 13.3 kilopascals. So again, we're going to go from high to low. So we're moving from the capillaries to the tissues. And so then in the tissues themselves, they're going to now utilize the oxygen. Now, as we mentioned before, in the tissue, that's where respiration is going to occur. So as respiration is carried on, it produces carbon dioxide by using that oxygen that was delivered to it. And so now carbon dioxide leaves the tissues and now goes into capillaries. So the opposite process occurs for carbon dioxide. So now we have high pressure carbon dioxide in the cell, low on the outside of the cell. And so now it's going to transport through that pressure gradient from high to low and then be transported back to the lungs. So just to quickly recap, the pressure gradients is what's the driving force of the gases that are used for respiration. In the lungs, high pressure oxygen, low pressure in the capillaries. Oxygen goes into the capillaries. Now the capillaries are going to take it to the tissue. Capillaries around the tissue, high pressure in the capillaries, low pressure in the tissue. Oxygen then is going to move from high to low pressure into the tissues. The tissues then use that oxygen, go through respiration. Respiration now produces a high pressure gradient of carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide then leaves and goes into the capillaries, and then it's transported back to the lungs. So oxygen exchange and carbon dioxide exchange is all due to pressure gradients. Again, we can look at it more closely. Again, this is high oxygen, so this is going to be your 13.3 kilopascals, and that kilopascal is going to cause, or that high pressure is going to cause the oxygen to go in to the bloodstream. The opposite's true when it comes back as CO2. It's now going to go back into the alveoli, and again, the alveoli are this nice single layer of cells, really good for gas exchange, really high surface area to volume ratio, right? Super, super high, allows for easy exchange of the oxygen. Now, the transportation of carbon dioxide, it does work on pressure gradients, but it actually gets transported by 3 different mechanisms. The first mechanism is just blood plasma. It just goes into the capillaries, kind of gets absorbed into the blood plasma itself. About 7% of that just gets transported and then gets moved back into the lungs. The other 20% goes with hemoglobin. It has an affinity for CO2 as well, gets captured by the hemoglobin, moves back to the lungs. The bulk of it, which is 70% of it, goes through a chemical process. And so we'll just quickly outline this chemical process in terms of how carbon dioxide actually moves into this, what's referred to as carbonic acid. So, in the tissues, in the blood plasma, carbon dioxide is released, right, from respiration. We also know that water is also released from respiration. What they do immediately in the blood plasma, so this is happening in the blood plasma, they're going to combine and they turn into carbonic acid. So remember back to grade 10, we talked about acids. Acids have an H in front, so this is the CO3 is the carbonate. So now it's going to combine with the hydrogen, which would be from the water, and it's going to form a carbonic acid. This doesn't stay together very long, and so really almost immediately after the carbonic acid's formed, it breaks up into 2 parts. So we go, then really the second step is it's now going to take the H2CO3, and now we're going to form hydrogen ions plus a bicarbonate, which is HCO3 negative. Now, hydrogen is an acid. So if we have lots of hydrogen in our blood, then it becomes acidic, and then we know just from our digestive lab that high acidity levels cause things not to function properly in terms of enzymes. So the body has to regulate that and get rid of that hydrogen. So what happens is the hydrogen ions, they combine with hemoglobin, and that hemoglobin will take it back to the lungs. The bicarbonate is safe, right? It's a base, and it's not going to really harm the body. And that bicarbonate itself, it does what calls buffers, and so really we're just neutralizing the acid in the blood. And so that's what the body does. And so to kind of combat the acidity level, it buffers it, and then when it buffers it, it takes it all back to the lungs. And then once it's back in the lungs, so at the lungs, then the hydrogen ion comes out of the hemoglobin, then combines with the carbonic acid that's present in the blood plasma, and then that produces H2O plus carbon dioxide, and both of those are expelled out through the alveoli and out into the atmosphere. So that's an important process, because when you exercise, hydrogen ions will accumulate, and so your body needs to get rid of them. Otherwise, your body doesn't actually perform anymore. And if you're a person that has run races and you get a really, really high acidity level, you find that you can't actually, your muscles don't function as well. So that's something we'll talk a little bit more about when we start talking a little bit more about exercise. Now, last thing I want to talk about is something that you're going to need to know for a lab. And so I'm just going to quickly define what different terms of lung capacity are dealing with. So the first one is total lung capacity, which is really just your maximum volume of air that you can breathe in. The second one is tidal volume, which would be how much air you breathe in just in a normal resting state. So like every breath you might be breathing in, say, half a liter. Inspiratory reserve volume is how much air you can breathe in after a normal breath. So you take a normal breath in, and then you try to fill your lungs up to maximum volume. So the difference between your normal breath and how much more you can fill up is your inspiratory reserve volume. Expiratory reserve volume is the opposite. So now you're going to breathe out normally, and then you're going to try to force as much air out of your lungs. And so that would be the additional volume that you can kind of push out of your lungs, above and beyond your normal exhalation of air. Residual volume is the volume of air that's always present in your lungs. This will never change because you need air in your lungs in order to prevent your lungs from collapsing. So this is a constant volume that is the minimum amount of air that you have to have in your lungs in order to keep your lungs actually functioning. Your vital capacity is something that you'll test in a lab later on this week, and that's going to be how much air you can actually breathe in, how much oxygen you can breathe in order to have your cells fully functional with the amount of oxygen that is required. So this is really how much oxygen can you process in a period of time. The last thing for your lab that you're going to have to know for the later part this week is you're going to have to look at what's called resting VO2 and maximum VO2. And just to really quickly go over this, because this will make more sense when we actually do the lab, it's really your maximum or resting VO2 is really how much oxygen can your body take in, utilize for its exercise, and then have carbon dioxide come out from respiration. So it's really how fast can you process this oxygen. And it's based on a number of different factors. So just in general, someone who is an endurance athlete that runs long distances would have what's called a high VO2, meaning they can take in lots of oxygen, process that oxygen, and keep running at a really high rate. Someone who has a low VO2 max would be someone who would run, maybe do a lap around a track, and have a really hard time kind of keeping up their pace. So again, we're going to look at that a little bit later on, and it'll probably make a little bit more sense for that. So you can just read through this slide and just know that both for lung capacity and also VO2 max and resting VO2, we'll explore both of those topics in a lot more detail in a lab that we'll do a little bit later on.